Two, one. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Richard Siracusa, and he has recently published a book. The title of the book is Your Eyes or Your Life, the true story of the Central Park Jogger Rapist, and it was published on June 6, 2019, and it's a very timely book. It concerns some recent documentary that came out on Netflix. He's also written another book about his experiences as a criminal defense attorney. The title of that book is Stranger Than Fiction, a criminal defense attorney's memoir, that was published March 8th, 2017. But Richard has some excellent first-hand information regarding this well-known criminal case that happened in New York. And I read his book. It's an excellent book, very detail-oriented. I learned a lot. And so I'm really delighted that Richard takes time out. He just had recent surgery, so I'm really glad that he made the show. So, Richard, are you there?
I'm here.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for agreeing to the interview. For people who don't know you, Richard Siracusa, can you talk a little bit about your background in the law and how you became interested or how you got involved in this case and why you wrote the book?
Okay. I sort of got involved. Guy got involved in criminal law. Was sort of handed to me. I was living in New York City, not doing much of anything. I was several years out of college. I went to law school in the evening, and while I was there, and when I knocked on the door of the Legal Aid Society, the Criminal Defense Division in Manhattan, and I asked if they needed some kind of paralegal work. I said I was in school. I knew nothing about the courts, and but I wanted to learn. And the man who was in charge at the time, very, very knowledgeable guy, very wonderful guy named Milton Adler, he said, sort of looked at me very strangely. He said, "We don't have any room for someone like you." Then all of a sudden his eyes lit up, and there was a position open for me as a paralegal for one of the craziest lawyers I've ever met in my life. He was brilliant, but he was just crazy and neurotic. And it was doing post-conviction remedies, or we were doing writs of habeas corpus for the inmates out in Rikers Island. I used to go to Rikers Island 2 and 3 times a week in the 1970s while I was in law school in the evening. But it was very difficult to satisfy this guy. Now, I did a lot of work for him. In fact, he said I did the work of 4 lawyers, but he still never appreciated it. And the slightest thing would go wrong, he'd scream at me. And but I did learn a lot going out to Rikers Island. I talked to a lot of inmates. I learned about post-conviction remedies. And like I said, this guy was really brilliant, but very difficult to deal with. He was mercurial, to say the least. Sort of reminds me of our president now. And of course, he was a lot smarter. So I learned a lot. But after a while, after going to Rikers Island and doing post-conviction work, most of writs of habeas corpus for people, for the inmates who had certain issues while they were in jail, had warrants outstanding. Every once in a while, we would come into I went to talk to my mercurial leader's mentor. Not my mentor, he's my tormentor. I was really going crazy with him. Every little thing I ever do is wrong. And anyway, so he transferred me from the Bronx, where I was working, to Manhattan, where I really started learning about the courts and evidence and things like that. My mercurial leader was a brilliant guy, but he knew nothing about evidence. And anyway, so I got there. So I did 2 more years there. The lawyers came up to me because even the heads of the Legal Aid Society at the time weren't trained properly, and I knew the courts. And so after a while, I got to be the de facto leader. Even though I was a clerk making maybe $6,800 or $7,000 a year because I knew the courts. Well, at the end of my term, when I finally took the bar exam, they didn't hire me because of that, and because of the bad word put in for me by my ex tormentor. And so I went off on my own. I went to Washington D.C., worked there for several years. I used to, like I said, I used to go back and forth on the train and do something in the morning in Washington, come back, do something in the afternoon in New York. And like I said, I knew I was tired, but I would do it 3 times a week. Because the third time I would completely sleep on the train, no matter what the time of day it was. And Washington, D.C., I found to be very intolerant of people who didn't work within their system. They also thought I was and they knew I was from New York City. I'm really from Central New York.
Right.
I talk about it in my books, and but you hear New York, naturally think it's New York City. And I really felt as if I was discriminated against. I think they mostly thought they didn't know what my last name meant. Siracusa, it's spelled exactly like the town in Sicily. My family comes from the other side of the island, but back there that there was no ethnicity down in Washington in those days. This is the 70s. It's changed a lot now, but in those days they couldn't pronounce my name, and so they thought I was Jewish. And I said I was saying to myself, I'd walk in there because they said that I knew I was from New York. I said my ancestors kicked out the Sephardic Jews from Sicily about 500 years ago. And I said, why are you giving me such a hard time? I was held in contempt for no real good reason. It took me 2 years to get rid of it in the Court of Appeals. So I knew the handwriting was on the wall. I came back to New York,
Right.
where that's when I was still in law school. And so I started, at this time I was actually starting as a lawyer. So I just, I hung out my shingle, started picking up cases, and got into public defense work that way because that was really the only thing I knew. And so I had a long career doing that. I never worked for a public defense agency. I worked for a panel called the Assigned Counsel Plan, and I had a lot of experience. So I sort of immediately started taking homicide cases and very serious felony cases, and I made a pretty good living that way. Plus, I had a small private practice on the side where I would be retained, but most of it was public defense work. And I wrote And so after all those years, I decided to write a book about it. That's the Stranger Than Fiction book. Had a lot of crazy cases, and so people would probably like to hear about this. Well, as I was doing my notes for that case, I came across the Central Park Jogger case again. Now, I handled the guy who confessed 12 years later, okay? His name is Matthias Reyes, a psychopath who murdered a pregnant woman in front of her 3 kids, and plus raped and mutilated the eyes of 3 other women. He was a psychopath, very childish, hard to deal with. In fact, I took over from another guy who he had assaulted. Now, this was an assigned case. This was a public defender case. So I took over the case, and I took over around 1990. The Central Park Jogger case there were parallel cases in front of the same judges, but nobody knew that they were connected in any way.
Right.
At least at that time.
Honorable Thomas Galligan, right? Was the same judge?
Yeah, Tom Galligan. That's why when I saw what I could stand with the Netflix series, Tom Galligan would have never tolerated the histrionics and the overblown the melodrama. He would have thrown Elizabeth Letter out of the courtroom and probably had her fired from the DA's department. So it's really he was a fair guy. He was very conservative, but he would have never tolerated something like that. And that's what really got me upset about it. And because I've had 5 or 6 trials in front of him. Right. I know what he's like. Right. In fact, when he retired, we used to talk on the street together. And anyway,
but just going back to Matthias Reyes, that's the title of your book, is Your Eyes Are Your Life, because it was something about him, and we can get into the details.
Oh yeah,
of his crimes.
I'll go back.
Okay,
my
good.
First part of the book. Yeah, when he assaulted the women, especially the first ones and the second one, he assaulted them. He was a prolific rapist. In other words, when he'd rape them 2 or 3 times, and plus sodomize and do a whole bunch of things to them. But then, like a little kid, he didn't want to be identified. So he would ask the women, it's either your eyes or your life. He said, in other words, I'm going to take out your eyes or I'm going to kill you because you can identify me. As it turned out, he sort of backed out of that situation. In the 3 of the 4 women he raped, he was known as the East Side Rapist, and he was very notorious during the time of when the Central Park Jogger case happened. And they finally caught him in August 5th, 6th of 1989 as he was finishing one of his rape, and he was actually caught by a very observant superintendent of a building on the east side, plus one of the neighbors who trapped him and captured him for the police. But the other rapes that he did, he would say, "Your eyes are your life," and he would jab the women around the eyes, poke them in the eyes, and create create cuts. And, one woman, he tried to drown in the sink of her, the first rape. He tried to drown her in the sink of her bathroom after he raped her a couple of times. Then he started slamming her head against the bathtub. But he would always sort of back away from that, really cutting out the women's eyes. The women's were, some would beg him, some, I need the eyes for my work. I don't want to die. But he would not kill them. But on June 14th, 1989, he went into a place in East 97th Street. If you're coming from LaGuardia, you can see the building. If the taxi goes in from the east side of Manhattan toward the west side, goes along 97th Street, you can see the building. He faked being a superintendent. No, actually, he faked that time looking for somebody. The woman was there with her 3 kids. She was about 6 or 7 weeks pregnant. She lets him in. Then she realizes she made a big mistake. Anyway, she puts the kids in the bedroom. He rapes her on the bed, and her husband was a superintendent, but he was away for the afternoon. But she got really upset with him, started screaming at him in Spanish, swearing at him and all that. And then she had a knife she brought from the kitchen. He disarmed her very quickly, and just stabbed her about 7 to 10 times. It was very dramatic, and so she collapsed. And the kids are in the other room, heard their mother screaming. They came out. In the meanwhile, he holds onto the knife and leaves a separate way, actually climbing over a fence in the back, which leads out onto like 98th Street, 99th Street, to try to get away from there. He actually had difficulty getting out of there, but she's in the bedroom area, the separate bedroom area. The kids are there. What's the matter, Mommy? What's happening? There was 6 and 7, and there was a baby, 5 months old, Amanda. Okay, Amanda was on the bed. So the mother collapses on the floor where her apartment was. It was just below the main lobby. It was the superintendent's apartment. Okay, one of the kids gets out. I don't know how he got out of the door. Carlos, or both of them, they go upstairs to the lobby, and they said, and then they start talking. And this neighbor was coming in, and she looked at the kids there, and she told the cops that the kids looked worried, and they're knocking on the door of one of their friends who was this woman named Harriet Zetchmer. It was her neighbor, and Harriet, kept her ear to the door after she closed it. Then she walked outside, and she starts talking to the kids, and the kids says, "My mommy's hurt." "My mommy's hurt." So I think that they sort of described what happened to them as best they could. Because like I said, they're 6 and 7. And so Harriet Zetchmer calls the EMS. But by that time, EMS was already on the way, because the woman, Lourdes Gonzalez, the one who was stabbed, actually called them as she was bleeding all over the place from her basement, her apartment telephone. As the neighbor Harriet was calling the police, the door to the elevator opens, and it's Lourdes Gonzalez stabbed and bleeding to death, and she collapses on the floor in the lobby. By that time, the EMS people are there, and they come in. The two men come in. One of them asks a guy named Vincent Gatto, ask her, who did this to her, were you stabbed and all this. Now she could gargle. She just gasped, my baby. And he's looking around. There's no baby around. So little Carlos comes up and says, my sister's downstairs in the basement, and I'm worried about her. So they couldn't get back downstairs to the elevator because the elevator had a key, and so the elevator wouldn't move to go back down to the basement. So the EMS worker goes outside with Carlos, little kid, and the door to the basement apartment is actually locked. It was locked by my client, I think, when he left. And so the EMS worker, and Carlos is crying, and I'm worried about my sister. The baby's 5 months old, right?
Right.
And so he kicks in the door, and he goes into the apartment and sees a mass bloody scene. And the baby's okay. The baby's on the bed. So the EMS worker grabs the baby, goes upstairs. By that time, his partner had put mask pants on Lourdes Gonzalez. That's to increase the pressure, because she practically had no pulse, and she was practically bled out on the floor. And so what happened was that they immediately took her to the hospital, but they took the baby also. The baby had some blood on her, and they had to check out the baby also. And Lourdes Gonzalez, the mother, lasted for about an hour and a half, and she was pronounced dead about 7. The baby was was okay. But
Right.
there was blood all over the floor. The EMS worker really had to look, had to think fast. He didn't know whether to help Lourdes Gonzalez bleeding to death on the floor in the lobby, but he knew he had to go downstairs to check out with the baby because the baby was only 5 months old.
Right.
So anyway, yeah.
But that wasn't his only. That wasn't his only rape. There was another one that there was an attempted rape. You talk about.
Oh yeah,
Courtney
yeah,
Phelps.
yeah. Well, the one that I made the connection, but the first one was the one where he banged her head against the bathtub and tried to drown her. The second one was actually the murder. The third one was on July 19th, where you makes the connection, where I made the connection with the Central Park Five. He raped a woman, and then after raping her, he said he was going to call 911 to help her, which he did. Incredibly, I got the recording after he left the apartment. But he tied her up in a certain way. He also jabbed at her eyes and tried to take out her eyesight, but he didn't actually do it. And she got to a window and started screaming out the window somehow. But he tied her up in a very signature type of way, okay? And it was exactly the same way the Central Park jogger was tied up when the police found her back in April. Now, this is July of 1989. The Central Park jogger case happened April 19th, 1989.
Right.
Now, we don't know there's any connection here between my client. He never told me nothing, okay? But that woman was tied up in the same way. Not only that, he said he was with a guy named Steve, who when he went into that apartment, a guy named Steve helped him. They looked out for this woman. My guy followed, and his MO was to follow them, then push him in to the doorway or go up in the elevator with him and attack him, pretend he was part of the building himself. But this guy Steve was on the outside, sort of. And when my client went into the apartment, raped the woman and brutalized her, Steve was on the outside in the stairway. And also he got hold of a knife from this guy, Steve. He kept saying Steve, and he described Steve perfectly, like curly hair, his complexion, right. Very light complexion.
Scar on his cheek.
Dark
right?
eyes.
Distinctive scar on the right side of his cheek, on the right cheek.
Well, it wasn't sort of distinctive, but my client described it was a scar. Right. And it was shorter than he was. But the really distinctive thing was the hairstyle. He said he had dead hair, and dead hair means it was in its natural state, which means it was curly. Okay, and it was really curly. And so I'm looking at this stuff and I say, this is a very detailed description. This is something, he couldn't have made up out of his head. Not only that, this guy's actions that he said he did with him when he was in the rape of July 19th also sounded very coherent and very logical and very, put together. It isn't something, you would make up like, I know a guy named Jose, he lives uptown, I don't know where, type of thing. Right. They used to meet on a basketball court on the east side. And it turns out that he used to do robberies with this guy, Steve, prior to July 1989. And Steve told him that he was 23 years old. Okay. But he described this guy, Steve, perfectly. And they said these two robberies, and they robbed other people because he started confessing to everything he did. All right. He described this guy with the curly hair, the scar, the complexion of the skin, all that. And at the end of the interrogation, he tells the interrogator, "No, it's all a lie. There was no guy named Steve. Actually, there was a guy named Steve, but he was waiting for me on the corner. He wasn't part of the rape or anything like that. He was waiting for me on the corner because I owed him money. And I met him afterwards. In fact, it was Steve, or he said someone named Dave. A name Dave popped up, but I don't know where that came from. It was probably Steve who went to the ATM machine because he got the code from the woman who he had tied up. And it was Steve, because my guy was illiterate. He could barely write his name. I had to read everything to him at that time. He couldn't read English or Spanish.
And he was, can you talk a little bit about Matthias Reyes' troubled background? Troubled to say the least.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. His troubled background goes back to when he was a kid. His mother was schizophrenic. They came from a small city in Puerto Rico. The father and the mother had relationships and children with other people. The mother was schizophrenic, and she used to go around the village and scream, and people would sort of stay away from her because they knew what she was like. And he really wasn't educated at all. So at one point, his mother decides to go back to New York. and supposedly sells him. And I got this from his aunt, Reyes' aunt, who I talked to many years ago, that the father gave money to his wife or his girlfriend at the time. I think they were married. I'm not sure, but she was going to New York. She was going to live in New York, and the father was going to live in Puerto Rico. So he bought Matthias from the mother. The mother goes to New York, and Matthias spends a few years with him. And the guy was his father was an itinerant laborer and a grave robber, and he so he never got educated. Didn't want to go to school there, and his father really made no great effort to do that.
And
anyway,
Reyes, like you said, one of his IQ ratings was 71, so he was like 1 point over.
Yeah, he was borderline.
Yeah, right on the border.
But but he was a psychopath, and the psychopaths can be very charming. They know how to charm people. They know how to get around things. They're very devious. And so to me, that 71 was probably because he couldn't read and write. I thought he was more intelligent than that. But just in talking to just his verbiage, where he talked, even though he couldn't read. And so, but that is the MO of a psychopath. They sort of charm you, then all of a sudden you turn your back and they got you.
And there was allegations that he raped his own mother. Is that correct? In 1985. So
he goes to New York. He tries to get in school. He doesn't want to go to school because he can't read. They have all sorts of problems with him. Even the mother tried to. The mother's living with another guy who's a drug addict in New York. He's living with them. Now he's like 13, 14 years old. He keeps going back and forth to Puerto Rico. The father doesn't want him educated. But the time comes when he's like growing up. And when he was in New York, there's a couple of years there, we sort of connection where I didn't know exactly what had happened to him. But he did actually, he called it the accident. He raped his own mother. And during that period of time that was significant, he had jumped from a bridge in Puerto Rico and probably cracked a couple of vertebrae in his neck. And he was in the hospital for 3 months in this halo type of outfit with his neck very still. And that caused nerve damage in his neck. And as soon as he got out, he took off that thing he had and jumped off the bridge again. But this time he wasn't injured because he wanted to prove to himself he could do it. Anyways, so he's injured that way. He comes back to New York. The father is lost somehow. I don't know what happened to him. And he's got an aunt here and the mother. The mother still, but the mother at this time moves with a new man. They went to either Rhode Island or Boston. I think it was Rhode Island. He said it was Boston. So he's like on the street by himself. And I don't think he had much contact with his aunt. And he keeps talking about a grandmother, but I never knew where the grandmother was. He was making these comments. He was reluctant to confess because he thought his grandmother would get upset, but I never knew where the grandmother was. I knew where the aunt was, but the aunt probably don't want anything to do with him.
And he was
the last time his mother's
right. He was finally arrested August 5th, right? So he
he was finally arrested August 5th.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so he starts talking. He starts talking about this guy Steve and all that, and so and then I go through the first DNA hearing in New York County. I had to call up Peter Scheck, who started the Innocence Project, because they had the first case up in the Bronx to try to get an expert witness and all that. So the case went on, and at the last moment, we were set for trial. There was hundreds of jurors in the courtroom, Tom Galligan's courtroom, and I had my own expert, and my expert said, yeah, we can get it down to a 500 to 1 ratio that it could have happened by chance, but since there's 4 matches, it would be 500 to the 4th power, which is an astronomical number, which is really going to sink you. As it turned out, the DA didn't really look at it that way at the hearings in any event. So I told him, I said, listen, if you get convicted after a trial, you're going to do 75 years to life and you're going to die in prison. If you take the plea, because the district attorney, Pete Castellaro, didn't want the kids to come in to testify and didn't want the victims to come in and testify, having to face them again. So he gave him a plea deal of 33 and 30 years to life, okay? Which means he'd probably be eligible for parole around 2023. This is like he was in jail since 1989. This is like 1991 now.
Gotcha.
And so as we're standing there, the jury pool parts like the Red Sea, and this little guy in a yellow cabana shirt comes walking up the aisle, and my guy turns to me and says, "That's my father. Can I talk to him?" So Galligan clears the courtroom and goes over, talks to his father about 10 minutes, myself and the district attorney stand aside. Then when the conference is over, of course, the court officers are all around him, says, I'll take the plea. I'll plead guilty. So he did. He pled guilty, and he was promised a 33 and a third year to life. And that was the first time I really sort of noticed his psychopathy. And he looks at me, you're happy I pled now? He goes, hey, you're happy I pled? I said, it's your decision. You might get out of jail this way. The other way, you've never gotten out of jail. So anyway, case adjourned for 2 or 3 weeks. He came in for sentencing. I actually bought him some candy and stuff to try to soothe him. And as I walked into the court, there were like 7 or 8 court officers. I said, well, this is, the guy isn't that big, but he starts trouble, 3 or 4 could do the job. Well, anyway, I snuck him the candy in the back. He comes out, and the district attorney gives a long statement. And then I said something like, my client's incredibly sorry about what he did, and like that. Then all of a sudden, it's his turn to stand up and say something. So he stands up. I'm right next to him. I'm standing to his right. Now, he's left-handed. I'm standing to his right, and as he stood up, he says, fucking judge. But the court reporter didn't hear that. And once I heard that, I pretty much knew what was going to happen. But I jammed myself in with the chair and the table. And he says, I didn't do nothing. There was somebody else there with me, and these lawyers that you give. And he turned with his right hand to get more torque on his punch because I'm standing to his right, and gave me a split second to duck my head. But he did hit me in the forehead with a hard punch. It really didn't hurt all that much, but it did knock me over the table. And I fell over the table on the floor. And as I was on the floor, he was coming at me again. That was the problem. And I saw the look of the devil on his face. And so he came at me again, but by this time there were 6 or 7 court officers on him and pulled him as he was coming toward me, pulled him off of me, and they had him spread eagled, carried him. Last time I saw him, he was screaming and yelling, and there were like 60 people in the audience, reporters, a couple of victims, the woman who got murdered, her family, and everyone was just sort of gasping. And I was still on the floor, sort of looking up at him, and they just pulled him out of there, and the judge sentenced him in absentia. Gave a little speech about what a dangerous person this guy was. And like I said, I thought that was the end. I would never ever see him again. He was sentenced. The welt on my forehead cleared up in a little while, and I went on about my business. And the next year, there was the Central Park Jogger Trail. I really knew nothing about it. In fact, I thought Steve Lopez was one of the 5. He wasn't. Then as I started doing my memoir, I was going to put Matthias Reyes' case on it. Then I discovered this audio tape, which I had totally forgotten about. And it was also a transcription of what he said. He started talking about this guy, Steve. So I said to myself, I was just going to put him as one of the stories. Then I began to go over the file. The file was like was more than 25 years old. All the pages were yellow. I had forgotten about it. I'm looking and it says, wow, this is something. But in the meantime, in 2002, he started confessing that he was the one that raped the Central Park Jogger, and he did it alone. Okay?
Right.
And then they decided.
This Halloween, No Cap presents a pay-per-view event like nothing you've ever seen. Travis Barker's House of Horrors. Featuring performances by Machine Gun Kelly, Avril Lavigne, Black Bear, special guest Mark Hoppus, Ian Dior, Jaden Hostler, and more. October 28th. Get your tickets now. NoCapShows.com.
I had to run his DNA 12 years late, 11 years late. Why they didn't do it when I had the case, it would have changed. They didn't. I pretty much know what the reason was. But anyway, I was talking to this New York Times reporter. He's a senior court reporter.
William Rushbaum? Was it William
Rushbaum? Yeah. And I said, he said, did you, when he called me, this is 2002, did you represent Matthias Reyes? I said, yes, I did, but the last time I saw him, I was on the ground looking up at him. We had sort of a laugh about that. Thought, well, he's confessing to raping the Central Park Jogger. Not only that, they decided to run his DNA, and it was only his DNA that was found. I think it was found on her and then on a set of socks. And he's saying that he did it by himself. So I was on television. I was interviewed by magazines. I said, yeah, he's perfectly capable of doing this by himself. He's a psychopath. There's there was no question in my mind that if he wanted to do it by himself, he could. So I never really gave it another thought until several years later when I was doing my notes for the memoir. I came across this audio tape. Now, I had granted an interview to Sarah Burns, Ken Burns' daughter, which was a mistake because I thought she really knew what she was doing. I thought she'd be on. She had an agenda also. Plus, she didn't really have the experience. She was in way over her head in terms of experience within the criminal justice system. I think she was a paralegal for one of the one of the partnerships that actually handled the civil case.
Right. She was biased because she was, when eventually the Central Park Five, as they were called, wanted to sue civil.
Yeah,
she was doing
She was doing the book.
Right.
But I thought, in fact, I asked her a stupid question. I said, "Are you related to Ken Burns?" She goes, "Yeah, he's my father."
Right.
So, I was talking to her, but at the end, I said, I had an uncle. Burns had just done this thing in World War II. I said, I had an uncle that actually fought at Guadalcanal, which is true. I said, tell your father, my uncle, my uncle had died by then, but it would have enjoyed it very much because, he really served in the Pacific Theater. She sort of laughed at me, And I looked at her and it was sort of like, why would I talk to my famous father about that to someone like you? And I looked at her and I said, I made a mistake with this. But anyway, I cooperated with her. I regret doing that. She was totally one-sided, didn't do any research, so
right,
when I read the book,
that wasn't even done because she didn't do just a book; she did a documentary as well. Correct?
Oh yeah, the documentary was even worse. In fact, I had a little online fight with her. I said, why didn't you talk to me? The linchpin of your whole operation was my client, and you give him a 4-second walkthrough of the whole thing. So anyway. That was the last I contacted with her.
But the thing is that became kind of a cause célèbre. That they turned the Central Park Five.
Cause célèbre. Oh yeah.
And they sat down.
Oh
and
yeah,
I think
that became the story. That became the narrative.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. It was. She went into the poor kids. That little famous line from West Side Story. They're depraved because they're deprived, type of thing. And I said, that wasn't what I talked to you about. I said, I got like a page and a half in her book. It was accurate what I said, but it wasn't really what I talked to her about. And I'm saying to myself, what the hell is going on? A 4-second walkthrough with my client and everything else, concentrate on those poor kids who were practically beaten up by the police, had their wills overborne by the police, police put words in their mouth and all this.
Coercion, right. Well, also
that's not it.
The innocence idea is that because Reyes confessed, and he took full responsibility. It means that the Central Park Five were not involved, even though there were other events that night that involved action.
Yeah. Right? Oh yeah. They readily admitted to hitting a jogger named John Locken over the head with a metal pipe. I remember on one of the radio stations in New York, it said, they were just engaged in a little mischief. I tried to call in and said, no, that's felony assault. That could have been, know what a subdural hematoma is, bleeding on the brain. That could have happened. The guy named John Loppen, he was in a hospital for about overnight. Then they determined there was nothing wrong with him. Plus, they beat up another jogger, and they kicked the hell out of a homeless guy. Took his food, called him the bum. Right. But somehow this thing happened in a vacuum. Okay, they weren't there, and then I started reading over their statements. I decided I was going to do a book about it. I started reading over the statement. I said, and I've heard these statements before from kids. Yeah, they're there, they see it, but it's not them, or they didn't do a lot. It was somebody else. Sounds like a 14 or 15-year-old kid would say. Okay,
right.
And so I got into it, and I started looking. I said, and I was sort of stuck in my gut because I've heard hundreds of those statements from kids. I said, they had a ring of truth about them. The cops couldn't have possibly told them to say all that stuff. And what was overbearing in all of this was that she was in a coma for 9 or 10 days, the real jogger. And the cops are taking all these statements, from the kids and all that. And how did they know what she was going to say when she woke up? They would have lost their job. They would look like absolute fools, dealing with 13, 14, and 15-year-old kids. There were 37 of them. And, I'm sure they would at least been demoted, if not fired. because then it would have been pretty obvious what the cops are doing in order to get the confessions out of them.
Right.
And plus, when you're dealing with 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, the parents have to be there. All right. No cop in his right mind will start talking to a kid who says he's 13, 14, 15 without calling up the parents. The parents could have stopped that interrogation, say, don't talk to my kid anymore, no more. That's it. And the cops would have had to stop.
Right.
Plus, if the cops did something like that, any judge, the most conservative judges, would have been obliged to suppress all that evidence.
Right. But the thing is those are all videotaped, so you can see the videotape confession with the kids, at least Richardson and Anton McRae and Tron. Those are there, and the parents are right there, and they're talking. And Richardson's talking about a scratch.
And I never quite understood, the whole thing could have been blown up in the cop's face if she woke up. No, it was just only my client, Matthias' face, but she didn't remember anything. That was the problem. Plus, they didn't run my client's DNA. Plus, there was one cop in particular who was involved with my client, told him he was sexually assaulted because they suspected my client of the murder of Lourdes Gonzalez, but he didn't confess to it right away. So they called in a guy named Mike Sheehan, who was the detective's detective. He had a show on PIX, was the local channel here, Warner Cable's channel here, and he was like, and the detective's detective, and he should have known or should have realized, because he knew that he'd done his homework, how the Central Park Jogger was tied up and how the victim on July 19th, my client raped, and where the guy Steve was with him, they were tied up in exactly the same way.
Some kind of like prayer, like front of the body prayer kind of posture, right?
Yeah, the same thing. No, he tied them up in sort of like a prayer type fashion, wrapping with the jogger with a towel around her neck and put her hands in front of her legs and tied her up that way so she couldn't move. Did the same thing with the woman on July 19th. Right. And someone should have saw it.
Right, but you also, you kind of in your book, I think you successfully took apart the whole notion that Reyes did it, because you knew your client had a neck injury, and according to according to the solo perpetrator theory, that means that Reyes had to have chased down the Central Park Jogger, then knocked her out, and then dragged her, which was admitted as fact, that like 3 city blocks, like 100 yards or something like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, but the story you told was even more preposterous. I'm a runner, okay? That's why I had my spine surgery. I finally wore out after all these years. But I've run nearly 100 marathons. Plus, this would have been my 29th consecutive New York City marathon. Plus, I went to a college that used to supply the Olympic team. I went to Villanova in the early 60s, where they had the world's fastest human, great runners, incredible runners. And they were friends of mine. And I couldn't run with them, of course, but I used to work out on a weekend every once in a while, and we would talk, and I learned a lot of technique from them. That's why I'm at my age, I'm still able to, continue to run as I do. I'm slow, but I can still run. Awesome. And then I'm saying to myself, he starts saying, he sees her running. Now, she runs 8-minute miles, okay? Now, she's running fast. You ever see anyone? I used to do it 20 years ago. Now, you're really moving 8-minute miles. And he says, he sees her, then he formulates what he's going to do. And I'm saying to myself, well, what's she doing? Is she standing still? He's standing still. She's running. And so he says he gets up behind her. He's yards behind her. He starts zigzagging behind her. Absolutely preposterous. She would have been out of sight if she was running 8-minute miles, which she could do. She was in great shape. She would have been out of sight in 10 seconds or less. No way in the world. Not only that, he could have caught her. Not only that, he picks up a stick, which also slows you down. Okay, because he's carrying a stick in his arm. He says he came up from behind her, caught her, zigzagging. She's running in a straight line, okay? I said to myself, this isn't right. From my own knowledge, because I know a lot about running. I said, not only that, even if you didn't know a lot about running, that's preposterous. The way she ran and how fast she ran. So then the second thing was, he first said, I dragged her. Then he changed the story, but I knew he couldn't have dragged her because he had the neurological impairment in his neck. Then he says he attacked her closer to the road where she was, and then she gets up. She's naked and she's barefooted, and she gets up and she runs the 3 city blocks to the point of the final attack. Right. Now she has traumatic brain injury. All right. Now she's running, and I said to myself, well, what happened to his Olympic speed? Why couldn't he catch her? He's running after her, but that's how she got the 3 city blocks, all right? And then at the end of that, she's got a traumatic brain injury. He decides to have a rational conversation with her by saying, where do you live? I'm going to burglarize your apartment, because that was his M.O. Besides raping, he was in there to all those burglaries and rapes. He wanted to find money. That was his M.O. And I said to myself, absolutely absurd, totally absurd. How could the district attorney's office even believe something like this? But that's what they wrote in their affidavit as to why he was credible. And I really started laughing to myself when I first read it, when I was doing research for the book. It was her 58-page affidavit dismissing the legal reasons she dismissed the case. That was proper, because had they had the DNA evidence back in 1991, 1991, they had the trials, it probably would have changed the verdicts no matter what. It was another guy, or it was my client. And I'm sure I would have been in there negotiating with the district attorney to get him the best deal possible. And I'm sure my client would have thrown everybody else under the bus. But one of the other main reasons is they couldn't make the connection between the Central Park Five and Matthias Reyes.
Right.
And I looked at this little tape, and I said, there's a connection. It's got to be Steve Lopez. And so one day, I was going through Getty Images with a friend of mine. I saw that picture, which is picture number 2 in the book, with the curly hair and everything. I said, this is unbelievable. That's Steve Lopez. And there's no question it's Steve Lopez. Plus, I got the third one when he was older. I couldn't dig up anyone. I couldn't find one of the right side of his face, a close-up. And by that time, he had grown, he was maturing. He had a full beard, and his head was shaved. But anyway, he had these 2 little marks on it, which could have been what Reyes was talking about. But I was beyond that. It had to be Steve Lopez. But then I said to myself, well, listen, Lopez was in jail. He was in Spofford. And Lopez was one of the most obnoxious of the ones. I'm sure Reynolds probably talked to you about that. He's the most obnoxious. He was sort of the leader of the group. Now, he's only 14 going on 15 now, but he looks old. So I'm saying to myself, geez, it's got to be, but he was in jail. Then I began to think back. In those days, the whole Spofford used to give furloughs to those kids, all right, where they would go back home as long as they came back after 2 or 3 days. And I was talking to a friend of mine just a couple of weeks ago. That was the whole idea of Spofford. Because they were 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, they didn't want to keep them in jail all the time. They wanted them to go back home to the family. So there was a distinct possibility that the Steve he was talking about could have been Steve Lopez. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced, because of the detailed way my client describes his actions, Steve's actions, the way Steve looked. Okay? Now, there was a good possibility he was on the street, then went back to Spofford. Because Lopez, you read in the book also that Lopez was the most, how can I put it, was the most mature or the most sophisticated of the kids that talked, because he never confessed. He kept his mouth shut. And that's the only reason why he wasn't indicted for the rape. Because all the other kids said he was one of the most vicious attackers. Him, Richardson, and Antron McCrae were the vicious attackers. Lopez was said by Kerry Wise and others that he starts beating her up, started punching her when she was on the ground because she kept screaming. He kept saying, "Shut up, bitch! Shut up, bitch!" And then when it was all over with, he was the one that suggested that they kill her to cover up try to cover up their actions like that. And I'm saying to myself, this, plus there's all stuff they did the Armstrong report, where the Armstrong had access to all these notes, and the Armstrong report wasn't written until like 2003. And I'm saying to myself, they found all these notes. What would they do? The police plan all these notes to be found 12 years later? They interviewed civilian witnesses who the kids made confessions to. Plus, there was a young girl named Melanie Jackson, who Kerry Wise had called her brother because there was a friend. And she gets on the phone and says, "Did you really do that thing?" And Kerry Wise says something like, "Well, no, I only did a little bit. They only grabbed the lady's tits." But he put himself there, and she was a totally civilian witness. Right. And she thought she came in as a witness. She thought she was going to help him, but what her testimony did was put him there.
Right, but the Armstrong report itself said that there was consistency that ran through all of the different people who were involved. That she was jogging, they knocked her down, they dragged her. There were several people, some people held her arms and legs. So they covered, it was all the same, there was similar stuff, Nobody can actually
plus
recite everything in the same manner. They wouldn't do that. But
plus, one of the most sophomore things of what's the name, Sarah Burns' thing was they try to actually give a timeline, to when these things happen. Now there was 37 kids in the park that night, and everybody's doing, they split up, so you don't know who did what to whom and what time. Plus, you don't really know how long it took the jogger to go from like York Avenue way on the east side of Manhattan, halfway across Manhattan, get into Central Park, and then by that time she's moving. And the place where she goes in is like 102nd Street. There is a hill there, and during the New York City Marathon, it's a real killer. It's a short hill, but at mile 23, it's a real killer, believe me. And anyway, they've taken it out of the marathon now. You go in like 10 blocks further south. But anyway, and I said the only way it could have happened is that she ran into them. And Carrie Wise gave a good description of saying that when she was running, she saw Raymond Santana to the left of her, was sprinting along next to her, and she got scared. And guess who's in front, ready to catch her? Steve Lopez. Santana and Lopez were buddies from the Schomburg houses. The whole thing fit because that's where my client lived. They used to meet at these basketball courts, even though my client didn't know Lopez's last name. And and one another reporter said to me, why would Matthias Reyes choose a 14-year-old kid as a partner in crime, sticking up pizza delivery guys and stuff like that? Because Lopez told him he was 23. He looked older. And my client didn't have the mental capacity to distinguish that. Okay, and so that's why he did it. I'm sure my client was very surprised. So anyway, and plus there was a fight at Rikers Island between Carrie Wise and my client, which happened around, I think it was July, August of 1990. Wise may have been already sentenced at that time, but they recognized each other. At least Wise recognized him. It was ostensibly a fight over a TV station or something like that in the rec hall, and they had a fight. They were broken up. Well, that was in 1990. But when they got to my hometown prison, they got to Auburn prison. I was born and raised in Auburn. I used to play handball against the wall, against the giant wall. It's right out of a James Cagney movie. That place takes up the center of the town. Anyway, they're in Auburn prison, and he says he has a qualm of conscience about, this guy's still in jail, and I really raped his Central Park jogger. But all he had to do was keep his mouth shut, because if Carrie Wise didn't know who he was, then he didn't know, why would he confess? Why would he feel bad? Wise would have never known the difference. Wise would have never been the wiser. Excuse me for the pun. Right. But anyway, but he said, oh, no, I did this because I had a conscience. I said, right, you're a psychopath, right? You don't have a conscience. You did this. So the only way it could have happened probably is what was alluded to in the Armstrong report, that that at that time, Carrie Wise was a blood, okay? And then the underground, right, Wise knew who Reyes was when Reyes got to Auburn prison, okay? And that's why, and he was threatened, and that's why Reyes came forward. Because, I mean, the story was not thought out at all. It was like it was a story a child would tell, disobeyed his mother or father or something like that. I mean, it was really foolish. Everything he said made no sense at all. And so I'm reading this for the first time. I said, I can't believe this. And they believed all this stuff, and they, and then they settled.
Right, they settled right away. Right when De Blasio became mayor, settled for $41 million, and just went with the Reyes. And now, what are your thoughts about this? Now they see us, this new Netflix documentary.
Well, my thought about it is this: the man who orchestrated all of this was Al Sharpton. Al Sharpton was a known informant for the FBI. Now, I've handled a lot of informants, okay, because it's my job to do it, try to get them a better deal, all that. I handled it. I did it on a professional basis, but I never liked any one of them. And so, so now this guy, he postures himself as a reverend. I don't know if he got a degree anywhere, and now he controls everything. So when I first talked to Eric Reynolds, I said, it could be a political thing, but now I became more and more convinced that it was De Blasio told him to settle when he came into office because he wanted to get the black vote. or was getting the black vote, wanted to get the black vote for a second term. No, they settled in about 2015. De Blasio, I guess De Blasio, yeah, he was in his first term. And
No, I think they settled within 45 days of de Blasio entering office. So it was
oh yeah.
There were other massive settlements as well, yeah.
Yeah, so and no, as an aside, I run in Riverside Park on the far west side next to the Hudson River. And I used to pass this federal judge all the time. Her name was Deborah Bass. Now, she was the one who was handling the case. Now, that case was in the federal court for like close to 8 to 10 years. And I didn't see her all the time, but I couldn't say a word to her, all right? Because I knew she was the one who was going to make the final determination if they're going to settle or not. But when they settled, I said, Judge Bass, can I tell you something? I said, yeah, I represented Matthias Reyes. She looks at me, and we had dinner together. We had a nice conversation. But I don't think even she was convinced of what I was saying about Steve Lopez. But she was a very nice lady. I sent her a copy of my first book. Anyway.
Right. Well, you finish off your book with your curious confrontation with Lopez. Do you want to talk about that?
I didn't know whether to go back up to talk to Reyes or not, even if Reyes was in Auburn prison. I had a serial killer up there named Joseph Christopher, and I used to go back there, and I knew the deputy warden who I went to high school with, but his name was Christopher, wouldn't see me because he didn't trust lawyers. I said, well, Bobby, just let me put him in a room, let me talk at him. He wouldn't even let me do that. So I remember having that. Then if Reyes remembered what he did to me in the last day we saw each other, would he open up to me? I don't know. So I didn't bother to go up there. But I did find where Steve Lopez was living through the investigator who was hired, was a very good friend of mine, who was hired by the one of the lawyers for the in the civil case that was being handled in the federal court. He found Lopez, and the Central Park Five were really angry with him because Lopez wouldn't cooperate. So, but we did. My investigator, this is a few years later now, retraced the steps, and we found where Lopez lived. I won't say exactly where because when I got there, there were toys around. So Lopez has kids, so I didn't realize. So anyway, I formulate my strategy, and Mike Berry is the name of the investigator. We park around the corner. This is out on Long Island, and we parked around the corner. And we're talking about how we're going to approach this. So we go up to the house, ring the doorbell. This middle-aged woman, maybe in her late 30s, comes to the door, and I sort of broke the rule. I broke the rule about what we were going to do. I said, "Is Steve here?" That's all I said, and her jaw dropped, her eyes opened, and she turned pale. And she didn't exactly say he didn't live here or he wasn't here, something like that. So we were very nice, and my investigator Mike said, well, do you know who owned the house beforehand and all this? So we had like a 30-second to 1 minute conversation. We were very polite. All of a sudden, from the background, we hear, "Shut the door," male voice. And so Mike and I look at each other and sort of wink, but that's Steve. So we left. We were very polite. We didn't want to bother the woman, and the door shut. And so we walked down the driveway. And we're about 30 feet in front of the house, and I noticed these two trucks were parked like I put in my book, they're like guided missiles, like could be controlled by remote control, to the SUV trucks. And so Mike decides he's going to stop and take the license plate and run the plates, see if they come back to Lopez. As we were doing that, the door flies open to the house. Now we're 30 feet in front of the house, maybe 25, 30 feet in front of the house. Standing on the sidewalk, all of a sudden, "What the fuck you doing?" Here, this guy comes out. He's bald, but he's very light skinned. He's almost as white as me, and but he has his hair is trimmed around the sides, but he's bald on the top. And he says, so Mike says, "But listen, we're standing on public property, which you were on the sidewalk." He really was in it. He really got hot, and he says, "Get off my fucking property." And that's when Mike says, "We're standing on public property, and we're not on your property," like that. He just looks at it, glares at us, goes back inside the house. And I said, "Mike, that's got to be Lopez." Well, why? Who would get upset at the mere mention of his name? We didn't say anything to the woman. I wanted to talk to him. "Were you there? Did you know Matthias Reyes ahead of time?" So as I put in my book, I said, Mike had played devil's advocate, saying it was only my client's DNA that was found on the jogger and all this other stuff. I said, "Well, Mike, okay, you have your opinion." Then he changes his opinion that one action who was the guy who was more than likely Steve Lopez. Because when I showed my investigator, we went to lunch in a place nearby, I showed him a copy of the picture number 3, where it has his head.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mike says, that's him. He has the same head. You know, the guy's bald now. That's 30 years later, and the curls are all gone. But that's him. I said, I know that's him. I said, his actions spoke volumes. I didn't have to interview him. And
wow.
so that absolutely convinced me that it was Lopez. And so we drove away, and I finished writing the book. Now I confronted him in December of 2018, just before Christmas. So then I finished up the book with an afterword, and then I tried to get it's published on Amazon.
Sure.
Nobody would touch it, you know. So in terms of a publisher. So
well, we're at 60.
So that's.
We're at 60 minutes, Richard. Is there anything else that
Okay.
you would like to add, or anything I missed?
Well, the 3 things: the rape that happened 2 days before, on April 19th, April 17th, that was never really investigated by the police. That was something that the police also screwed up very badly. They left a card in the door. She goes back. She calls them up. The cops didn't, because there was a fight between the sex crimes division and the trial division. And actually, Pete Casolaro, who was my adversary for Reyes' case, actually had the Central Park Jogger case first off. But Linda Fairstein, the author, whose reputation has also been besmirched by what's her name, Duvernay,
Right.
along with Elizabeth Letter, who was a great attorney.
Oh, okay.
Anyway,
Right.
I said they didn't investigate. Had they investigated that, they probably would have made, if Casolaro had stayed with the case, he would have tested Reyes' DNA in 1990. But since it went to the sex crimes unit, no, nary the twain shall meet. You know, they hated each other. You know, they had homicide cops working with the sex crimes division as a compromise. So everything got really, really fouled up. But that's all they had to do was investigate that case and run my client's DNA when they were supposed to. Everything would have changed.
Wow. Okay, that was a great interview, great book. Again, the title of the book is Your Eyes or Your Life: The True Story of the Central Park Jogger Rapist by Richard Siracusa, spelled Siracusa, published June 6, 2019. Richard, thank you very much.
Okay, so long, William. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.